All That's Left is made possible by our Patreon supporters. To help us continue this work, please consider contributing at patreon.com/leftvoice and make sure to visit our website at leftvoice.org. Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Oden. Today, I'm digging into the history of the U.S. revolutionary left and Trotskyism with Bryan Palmer, a historian focusing on labor and the left, who is a lifelong advocate of revolutionary politics. He's written extensively on American communism and Trotskyism, and on James P. Cannon, who is the founder of American Trotskyism and one of the main focuses of our episode today. In addition to discussing James P. Cannon, Bryan Palmer and I also talk about the broader U.S. socialist movement at the start of the 20th century, including the U.S. Socialist Party and Communist Party, as well as class struggle in the 1920s and 30s. And we also discuss Stalinism and the Comintern, and the founding of the Fourth International, among other topics that are key to understanding the history of the revolutionary left. I learned a lot from this conversation, and I really enjoyed it, and I hope you all do too. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Our pleasure, definitely. I wanted to start a little bit by asking about your motivations for writing about James P. Cannon and early U.S. Trotskyism in particular, because relatively speaking, there seems to be quite a bit written about the involvement of the Communist Party in labor struggles and civil rights struggles during this era, but not as many historians have given attention to the Trotskyist movement. So what motivated you to write about the early history of U.S. Trotskyism, and why in your work do you focus on James P. Cannon in particular?
Okay, well, one answer would be a very simple one, but a very inadequate one, which is that I think Cannon and Trotskyism are an intrinsically interesting story. And as you said, they've been very much understated in the writing on the American revolutionary tradition. There's virtually nothing written of substance about Cannon except the material, and some of it is quite good, but also limited, that came out of the movement itself. His own writings, the sort of commentaries of his comrades on his death, etc. So the reason that I really really decided, I think, to write on Cannon was I suppose there's a dual motivation, one intellectual and one political. Let me start with the intellectual, and it really is. If you look at the writing on the history of American communism, you have kind of two oppositional schools, really. An old traditionalist, in some sense, Cold War historiography that saw in the history of the Communist Party nothing more than Moscow domination and direction. The founding father of this, and he actually wrote amazingly good histories, given the blinkers that his politics placed on them, was Theodore Draper, who wrote 2 volumes at the end of the 1950s and early 60s, which are still foundational texts, I think, for anyone wanting to understand the history of the Communist Party. But the problem with Draper was that he could not get past the notion that there really was no indigenous American revolutionary tradition. It was a foreign import, it was alien, and as it followed Moscow's shifting lines, it was inevitably going to sort of fall into really traps and cul-de-sacs of sort of irrelevance for the American experience. You then had a generation of new leftists who sort of came of age in the 1960s and the struggles of the 1960s, who were looking desperately for that indigenous radical tradition. And they looked to the Communist Party, and there were lots of old communists around in the 60s that were willing to talk to them. They did a lot of oral histories, and they did a lot of, very good research on the history of the Communist Party. Draper and his followers became, in some sense, their intellectual, bête noirs. They structured their entire sort of oeuvre against the notion that this was just a foreign domination, just Moscow's sort of imposition. And so they saw the communist tradition in the United States as being led by Native American radicals who were, struggling against racism, against the exploitation and oppressions of class experience, and for a better world. And they aligned with them. Now, that's the intellectual sort of setting of a history of the American revolutionary tradition that basically ignores Trotskyism. Now, the political motivation for me writing was that, I had gone through the New Left. I had gone through, various attractions to anarcho-syndicalist politics, to politics aligned with what one might call a Stalinist tradition. I was close to the Progressive Labor Party at the tail end of Students for a Democratic Society. But I gravitated more and more as I kind of studied and looked at the political experience to a Trotskyist critique of the degeneration of the revolutionary process in Russia under Stalin's leadership in the years from the late 1920s, stretching into his death in the 50s. Trotskyism seemed to me to have a lot of answers to what was wrong, and I think we'll come to some of those later. So I wanted to sort of resurrect the Trotskyist tradition, which had gotten lost in this, oppositional, historiography. And what the Trotskyist tradition, it seemed to me, showed very interestingly was that you could find in the American experience a revolutionary current that was both embedded in the sort of traditions of American working class struggle, that learned from the Russian Revolution of 1917, was attracted to and won over to the politics of early Bolshevism, but that then broke from decisively the degeneration of that politics under Stalin. And it offered an alternative, therefore, to this oppositional historiography that said it's either, a standalone American radicalism, or it's a Moscow, foreign import. Trotskyism was neither. I mean, it actually learned from the Russian Revolution, but it was embedded in American traditions of radicalism. It opposed Stalinization, but it sought to carry forward the best traditions of what could be learned from the early experience of Bolshevism. And Cannon, in particular, was the embodiment of that indigenous American revolutionary tradition. He was the son of Irish immigrants, reared in Kansas, an instinctually American revolutionary who, cut his teeth in radical politics in that most American of revolutionary phenomenon, the industrial workers of the world, went through the Socialist Party, gravitated to its left wing, discovered in Bolshevism and the Russian Revolution, a politics that he could embrace and that he thought presented answers for the American working class, to which he was always almost umbilically connected. So that's really why, Cannon and Trotskyism captivated me, And their history, which we'll talk about later, is one in which there are, moments of tremendous importance that have been, in fact, bypassed by so much, not only of the mainstream American writing, but of even the writing of leftists historically.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I do want to get to many of the themes that you just brought up and his trajectory through the Socialist Party in particular. But before that, I kind of wanted to set the stage a bit and talk about the context that James Buchanan and his contemporaries were operating in. Because obviously, socialism in the U.S. didn't start just in 1917, but I wanted to hear a little bit about like what did socialism and the left look like at the very start of the 20th century, and in particular, I was curious also about what the Socialist Party looked like at this time.
Yeah, it's the socialist tradition in America is stronger than we would, mired in the context of our current moment, think. And the Socialist Party, in particular, prior to the 1920s, um, was, a vibrant but variegated milieu. It was, in some sense, it was a catch basin for all of the radicalisms that sort of emerged out of the 19th century and that were sort of coming into a kind of new context with 20th century development of monopoly capitalism, the more repressive sort of maturing of the state, et cetera, et cetera. So what you had was in some senses a series of parties within parties under an umbrella of this, catch-all socialism. Now, the I think the fundamental point about the Socialist Party, particularly at the moment of 1917, which was a kind of world historic moment of both the Russian Revolution on the one hand, but also of World War and the threat that that posed on the other. Um, the leading element of the Socialist Party was what one might call a conservative old guard. Uh, Often embedded in the more, I would say, respectable and accommodated elements of an immigrant radical milieu, particularly German immigrants who had long traditions of socialism and who were more social democratic in their orientation and reformist in their orientation than they were, say, revolutionary in terms of the Bolsheviks or even the IWW. Um, Gas and water socialism, if you will. They actually, controlled certain cities and and municipal governments in the Midwest. So that would be the leadership of the Socialist Party circa 1917, um, and they had a very tepid approach to 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 put it understatedly towards war. That is, they weren't mobilizing for an all-out opposition to war. They tended to be social patriotic and chauvinist. There were, however, other elements in the Socialist Party, including more radical elements of the immigrant community, revolutionary Jews, Finns, Latvians, Russians, who had experienced pogroms and repression in Tsarist, almost quasi-feudal like states in Europe, and had escaped those sort of coercive contexts. There was also the more revolutionary tradition of Eugene Debs, who was a revered figure on the left, and in some senses, by 1917, almost a kind of grandfather of the revolutionary forces. And Debs was always a profound internationalist, very much a revolutionary, although he had certain blind spots around race, and those kinds of blind spots ran rampant in some senses through this variegated socialist milieu. And you also had gravitating to the Socialist Party people like Cannon, and John Reed, who were drawn to and came out of more radical backgrounds, often associated with the IWW. I mean, it was common for, although we know of the Industrial Workers of the World as an anarcho syndicalist organization, they were a revolutionary organization, and many of them carried Socialist Party cards as well as their red IWW card. I mean, there was opposition to that from the old guard. Revolutionary working class advocates like Big Bill Haywood, for instance, were sort of turfed out of the IWW around 1912. So what you had was this socialist like catch basin in which by 1917 there was boiling to the surface all kinds of factional differentiations. Um, and the war and the Russian Revolution really heightened that process. And it was out of that that you would get the beginnings of an underground communist movement that Reed, Cannon, Louis Freyne, and whole contingents of Jewish and other immigrant, often foreign language speaking revolutionaries gravitated to.
Yeah, the Socialist Party is really interesting in its heterogeneity, which you partly described in Cannon's own description of the Socialist Party. I found really interesting too. He used the term, I think, a terrible hodgepodge of ideas, where surprisingly to me, apparently, like the leaders weren't particularly actively Marxist. And Cannon described them a little bit more as like the U.S. counterparts of the social democratic parties in Europe, kind of like you mentioned about the influence of the German social democratic tradition. So it is really interesting to think of what it was like before 1917 in the this terrible hodgepodge, as he put it.
Yeah, and Trotsky described the Socialist Party at the time, and he'd spent a bit of time in New York City, prior to the Russian Revolution. He described it, the leadership, for instance, as a party of sort of Babbitts and dentists, radical dentists. Um, that might be a bit harsh because what it neglected to see was the extent to which within that milieu you did have adherents of Debs and you did have traditions that, were far more revolutionary and radical. Um, and It all came to a head at a Socialist Party convention in 1918, where there was actually a three-way split, and with people marching out of the convention and setting up another convention, and the police actually being called by the conservative leadership to thwart the sort of oppositional elements, and it's a it is a hodgepodge, but you have to remember too that this is a moment in which the kind of notion of a disciplined party that in some senses was the creation of Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolsheviks, was a totally new and interventionist organizational movement on the compared to what had existed in Marx's time in the 19th century, or even that American Marxists like Daniel DeLeon had been really kind of aware or cognizant of. So the Socialist Party was both a breeding ground by 1917 for revolutionary possibility, and in some senses a break on the realization of that revolutionary possibility.
Yeah, and I think also as a perhaps more minor note, I think I we also take for granted these days as English speaking socialists the availability, the widespread availability of all of these foundational works and texts. Back then, they certainly didn't have Marxist.org and these sites where you could readily and easily read what the socialists at the time were saying and their theories and things like that.
Absolutely. I mean, even Cannon would later write that at the time of his movement into this communist underground, he had barely read Marx. a few pamphlets, Wage, Labor, and Capital, Value, Price, and Profit, which the De Leonites had distributed and run, educational classes on. That summed up largely the reading of most American, quote, Marxists at the time. Das Kapital was not really available, and very few had made any attempt to wade through it. And this was why, in some senses, the more revolutionary elements of the foreign language speaking sectors of the Socialist Party and that came into the underground communist movement had such reverence and respect on the part of the indigenous American radicals, is because they could read the German. They did have more contact with not just the experiences of European socialism and Marxism, but also with its foundational texts and sort of programmatic orientations.
So, like you said, James Buchanan joins the Socialist Party, and before that, he had been part of the IWW and things like that. And in the Socialist Party, he joins the left wing of it, but then he helped to found the legal Communist Party, the Workers' Party, around in 1921. Could you talk a bit more about why Cannon and his comrades at that time split with the Socialist Party?
Well, fundamental to that split was learning from the experience of the Bolsheviks there, and the creation of the first Workers' Republic, and its the Leninist contribution to sort of creating the possibility of the transition from socialism to communism, and the role of a disciplined party that Lenin accented as central to this process. Opposition to the war, and not sort of gravitating to the social patriotism and national chauvinism that basically destroyed social democracy, and its international in that period of 1914 to 1918. And the tremendous working class upheaval of the immediate post-World War I period, epitomized in general strikes and workers' mobilizations in 1919. All of this really sort of placed before the revolutionaries in the Socialist Party the necessity of creating a new organization that would build on, in some senses, the achievements and the clarifying perspectives of that pivotal period from sort of 1916 to 1923, when so much was happening. And it was really a process of breaking from the Socialist Party, forming underground cells, forming communist nuclei in various locations. But not only did they have to battle breaking from the Socialist Party and its loose structure, they also had to battle, in the context of the specific American conditions of the time, the notion that in some senses came over with the underground European immigrant milieu. In some senses, that milieu was trapped, incarcerated, in the view that everything must be clandestine, everything must be underground. We can't actually have, a party that's intersecting with masses of workers, because the repressive capacity that we know the state and capital is going to bring down on our heads is actually too great and too destructive. Well, Cannon negotiated, in some senses, this fear and this insularity that was present in so much of the revolutionary and largely immigrant and foreign language speaking milieu, with an appreciation that bourgeois democracy did offer certain, cracks in the wall of repression, certain fissures into which an above ground legal communist party could actually move. And in moving into those fissures, they could crack open the sort of uh, barriers to active involvement in, the class struggles of the time that were erupting. All, Great Steel Strike, the Seattle General Strike, different kinds of mobilizations of workers. Much of this wouldn't come to fruition until the 30s and 40s, but its beginnings lay in that 1917 to 1923 period. And so that was really Cannon's great achievement. And it was recognized. A Jewish revolutionary named Alexander Bittelman, wrote about Cannon that at his best, he was like a mechanic moving among, a kind of well-oiled machine of revolutionary possibility and bringing together various components of this, technology of this apparatus of revolutionary possibility and party building. And it was Cannon who made connections with Jewish communists like Bittelman, and who and who himself epitomized the Americanism of the revolutionary tradition in the IWW. He always referred to himself as a wobbly who learned something. And, so it was, and he actually helped to recruit William Z. Foster, who would later become, of course, a major figure in the Communist Party, but also an arch Stalinist enemy of Cannon's. But it was Cannon and another wobbly Ralph Chaplin who first broached to Foster, "Why don't you come with us? Why don't you be with us?" And indeed, multiplied hundreds of times. That's what Cannon was doing in this period from basically 1918 to 1921, bringing people who agreed on much, but who also saw the world so differently from their varied experiences, bringing them into an above ground legal communist party, the Workers' Party, that would, break out of isolation and actually be able to have an impact in the American working class struggles of the time.
I want to get to Cannon and his taking up the banner of Trotskyism and kind of, I guess, jumping forward in time a little bit. Because in, I think, 1928, Cannon was then expelled from the Communist Party for supporting Trotskyism and supporting the international left opposition to Stalinism. And he then helped form the Communist League of America. And from my understanding, a big part of the disagreements that Cannon and some of his comrades had, like Max Shachtman, had were on the question of, for example, internationalism. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about some of the ways that the U.S. Communist Party and the Comintern were degenerating during this time, and what really were the disagreements that led to people like Cannon um, taking up the mantle of Trotskyism and eventually being expelled from the Communist Party.
Yeah, that's a very important question and a large one. I think that to set the stage a bit to the answer to that, what you have to understand is that over this course of the 1920s, from 1921 to 1928, the American Communist Party, in some senses, evolved not necessarily as simply an import from Moscow, but certainly under the direction of and in a sort of symbiotic relationship with the Communist International. And in the earlier years, and I would say roughly from 1921 to 1924, 25, it's possible, I think, to make the argument that Cannon and others within the leadership of the American Communist movement learned a great deal from the Russians and saw in the Russian guidance that was offered much that was good. So, for instance, in Cannon's struggle to kind of liberate American communism from the kind of insularity and clandestine underground traditions that I talked about earlier. That struggle went on even past the formation of the Communist Party, because all of those, for instance, Russian speaking, clandestine, conspiratorial, underground types, they still remained in the party. They were an influence. And so it went on, that struggle. And as Cannon struggled to bring the party to the foreground in the American experience, he had the support of people like Lenin, Zinoviev, and others in the Comintern. They were the ones who said, stop this nonsense. Move into the open, make connections with the working class. And without that Russian and Bolshevik input and influence, who knows where American communism would have gone in this period. So the early Comintern guidance was, in some senses, exemplary. But over time, and particularly with Lenin's death and Stalin's increasing, and tightening grip on the apparatus of not only the Bolshevik Party, but the Comintern as well, more and more, the Communist International would be guided not by the Leninist and Trotskyist sort of animating force of world proletarian revolution, but of Stalin's, in Stalin's term, of building socialism in one country. So more and more foreign communist parties were judged to be, in fact, the sort of the subordinates of Moscow. And their policies, their practices were more and more subject to dictates from Moscow. And more they were forced to accommodate Moscow's needs rather than further advance the revolutionary prospects in their own countries. Classic examples of this were the British General Strike of 1926, where the Comintern played a role of essentially structuring that strike's, the Communist Party's role in Britain in those strikes into furthering Soviet interests rather than pursuing the interests of the General Strike. Or the sort of tragic history of the revolutionary movement in China, where, again, Chinese revolutionaries were sacrificed and thousands of them killed in order to accommodate Russia's relationship with China and the nationalist forces in China, led by Chiang Kai-shek. So in the United States, a major issue was how Comintern emissaries were coming and dictating to the party certain, often crazy and non-communist policies, particularly around, for instance, an issue like the Farmer Labor Party. This was an issue where, the communist emissaries and a figure named Pepper, Joseph Pogany from Hungary, played a decisive role in this. The Communist Party actually tried to take over and become the leadership of a farmer labor party, when what they, Cannon and others knew they really should have been doing was, in fact, making their allies with what was a weak leadership, and waiting until that developed into a movement of some force and significance, and seeing how it developed, rather than making it a paper organization of a communist party, which would then become, in some senses, responsible for a farmer labor politic that it had no real interest in pursuing, in terms of the class struggle nature of communist orientations. Now, all of this happened as the Communist Party in the United States became increasingly factionalized into there were three leaderships, really. Cannon, Max Chapman, Martin Aborn, and others formed an International Labor Defense Organization that was their bailiwick, defending Sacco and Vanzetti, defending immigrant and other workers victimized in the bourgeois courts, and providing aid to political prisoners. William Z. Foster had a stranglehold over the trade union, work of the Communist Party. And Jay Lovestone ended up running the sort of party apparatus, largely centered in New York or Chicago. In some senses, Stalin and his emissaries encouraged this balkanization because they could play one contingent off against another to make sure that none of them had sufficient power to actually challenge what was going on in terms of Stalin's increasingly interventionist role in the American Party. And this came to a head when at conferences where leaders would be elected and they would get a cable from Moscow overturning the actual election of the leadership of the Communist Party of the America. The joke that was circulating in Brooklyn, the joke that was circulating in the Communist Party was, why is the party like the Brooklyn Bridge? Because it's suspended by cables. And
Cables from
so
Russia, that is.
all of this took place without any understanding that there was really a left opposition emerging in Russia over the course of the 1920s, in which Trotsky, but many others, were centrally involved. Cannon, in fact, voted against Trotsky in Central Committee meetings in the American Party in the mid-1920s, and he knew nothing really about Trotsky. He was really increasingly disillusioned and disaffected with the factionalism that was stymieing the party that he had helped to build and that he saw as the answer, the revolutionary answer to American working class struggles. But he couldn't step out of, and he wrote this later, he couldn't step outside of his own embeddedness in some senses in the parochialism of the American imbroglio, if you will. He got pressure. He went to Moscow a number of times over the course of the 1920s. He didn't even want to go in 1928 to the Sixth Congress of the Communist International. But his faction pressured him to go because they said, look, you've got to be there. We've got to have, our main representative on the ground. He went, and with Morris Spector, a Canadian, he got hold of Trotsky's draft program, a critique of the Communist International, which highlighted some of these issues, including the Farmer Labor Party question that Cannon had known was instinctually was wrong, but hadn't been able to quite kind of put together what was the problem, as well as China, Russia, and other things. And the two of them read this and hammered it over and said, okay. And all of a sudden, Cannon later said, the light went on. What's been wrong with us is actually what's wrong with the Comintern. And we have to rebuild, in some senses, what was gained in 1917 and what now is being squandered. We have to bring back revolutionary internationalism. We have to bring back a revolutionary perspective on how to intervene in our own class struggles. We have to bring back the notion that communists have to be allowed in their own national settings, while learning from and being guided by a body like the Comintern, how to forge their own way forward. And he and Spector came back to North America with that, as their sort of cause for the foreseeable future. But it meant a tremendous break. This is a professional revolutionary who, from the age of 17 or 18, when he first joined the IWW, had dedicated himself to the cause of the revolution. He'd become a paid professional, party figure. His entire life, friendships, the wherewithal of his material everyday existence was tied into the party. As he said, it was a tough decision to break from the American Communist Party. He He said, I had to leave my swivel chair, sitting in the office, kind of dictating to the stenographer the next revolutionary leaflet. Um, and that was then, and I guess we'll talk about that in future questions. That would become the trajectory, not just of the next decade when he was building Trotskyism in America, but for the rest of his life.
Yeah, I find this history so informative, not just from the intricacies of Trotskyism and things like that, but also just when it comes to things like Stalinism and Stalinization, because learning about this period and reading also James Buchanan's own writing and own accounts of what was happening, it's really incredible to me the extent to which the Stalinist bureaucracy weakened the communist parties internationally and how like nefariously they really tried to exert their influence. Like in the US, for example, Cannon describes that the factions that you were talking about would, seek advice and seek mediation and things like that, apparently from the Comintern, but they would return to the US then actually in worse shape and even with more inflamed factionalism and things like that. Like it's really incredible to me learning about this history when it comes to Stalinization.
Oh yeah, it was. By the end of the 20s, it was brutalizing. I mean, and Stalin's arrogance in dealing with revolutionaries in the United States, astounding. I believe it was, Lovestone who finally confronted him in 1928 and 29 in Russia, and he was on the wrong side of the Bukharin Stalin fight inside the Russian party, which Stalin had won before it started, basically. But as Lovestone was about to depart to the United States, Stalin said, "Sure," he said, "you go back to New York." He said, "No one will speak to you except your wives." He just had this notion that this was a party that had been you know, a movement, the communist movement, that had been in a movement of debate, discussion, sometimes disagreement, but respectful charting of a revolutionary course, had really degenerated into the rule of an Iron Man in some senses, and his hangers on who were appointed by him to do his bidding. And Cannon had lived within that for, as I said, a despairing period in the late 1920s. He was pretty close, I think, to actually not perhaps dropping out of the movement, but basically scaling back what he thought the movement was capable of doing, perhaps keeping his job as a professional revolutionary, but settling into more kind of domestic relations with his friends and with ties longstanding ties to the friends in the movement like William Dunn, who tragically he would break from over this ultimate break. But in the end, he just couldn't stomach it. He had to fight for what he felt were principled beliefs and what he dedicated his life to, which he saw being, in some senses, undermined by the Stalinization of the Comintern and its reflection in the American Party.
I think this brings us up to an extremely pivotal year, to say the very least, which is 1933. So this is the year when, from my understanding, Cannon and the Communist League of America officially break from the Third International. And you mentioned some of the reasons earlier, and obviously there was at this point also really important international events like the counter-revolutionary betrayals of the Third International and the Comintern, like for example, the refusal of the Stalinists and the German Social Democrats to form a united front against fascism. And Cannon at this point writes that the Third International is dead to the revolution, and he actually even says that it's betrayed the proletariat even more shamefully, even more ingloriously than had the Second International back in 1914. So I have a sort of two-part question here, which is Firstly, could you say a bit more about why Trotsky saw the necessity of forming a fourth international at this point? And could you also talk about how the burgeoning US Trotskyist movement took up the task of building this new international?
Okay, I should maybe pause for a clarification, which is that when Cannon and those that he managed to gather around him were expelled from the Communist Party for embracing Trotskyism in 1928-29, they followed the path that the international left opposition and Trotsky had laid down, which is that as they broke from the Communist Party, either leaving it or being expelled, they nevertheless considered themselves what they called an external opposition to the Communist Party. And their attempt to rebuild the revolutionary movement was oriented thus to the members who stayed inside the Communist Party. They still saw the Communist International and its respective national parties to be the recruiting ground for for the rebuilding of and regroupment of the revolutionary left. And thus, they didn't necessarily see themselves as engaging in a lot of work with other left-wing organizations. The Communist Party and the Communist International were their target. They considered themselves still part of the Communist International, but because they'd been expelled, they had to be an external tendency within it. Now, over time, from 1929 to 1933, it was apparent that that politics and that orientation was in fact holding them back. I think the first inklings of this, and this emerged in critiques of this approach inside the Communist League of America by Cannon's younger allies like Max Shachtman and others, many others, who wanted to actually engage more in mass work, more in mass struggles, more in involving themselves in the politics outside of appealing only to the Communist Party. Now, the CLA did some of that. It was, of course, doing that, but it was always, in some senses, hedged in by what it could do because of its understanding of itself as an external opposition of the Communist Party. What really broke the back of that approach and orientation was the rise of fascism in Germany. And above all, the way that the Communist International reacted to that, which was not to, because this was the period in the early 1930s of Stalinism's most lurching turn to the ultra left. It was called the Third Period. In that period, Stalin and Moscow, which ran certainly from 1928-29 into maybe 1934-35, there was some wavering, but basically that's how long it lasted. In this third period, the communist parties in the Comintern said, anybody outside of our ranks is a social fascist. We work with no one outside of our ranks. We don't follow what had been Lenin's policy of borrowing from within, for instance, established trade unions. We set up our own red revolutionary trade unions that will actually, fight the class struggle to the end. Their attitude in Germany with the rise of fascism, some have summed up as saying, first Hitler, then us. In other words, let Hitler come to power. We'll be there to pick up the pieces. What that backed away from was what Trotsky instinctually knew was the only course, which was to build the broadest possible united front against fascism, so that fascism wouldn't be allowed to grow, smash the trade unions, smash the social democratic organizations, and of course, smash the communists in the process, which is exactly what happened. So eventually, Trotsky and Cannon and his comrades in the Communist League of America came to appreciate, as the anti-fascist and anti-war movement revved up in the United States, that there was nothing to be gained by keeping alive this notion after 4 years of struggle that we have to consider ourselves aligned with the Comintern. We have to recruit only, or we have to recruit primarily, I should say, Communist Party members and orient primarily to them. And also remember that in this same period, as these kinds of things were happening on the broad international scale of politics, the Stalinists were often vicious in their, homegrown repression of Cannon and others. Meetings were broken up as communist workers were marched into halls where Cannon was speaking with brass knuckles and furrier's knives. The Communist League of America could barely field a speaker without confronting the worst imaginable kind of forms of Stalinist thuggery, something that had been unknown on the revolutionary left prior to this, but that had existed in some senses in the trade unions, but that had been brought into, the communist milieu by Stalinist gangsterism. So after 4 years of this, all these kinds of struggles, Cannon and the Trotskyists, and Trotsky leading the way, said, okay, we have to, we are now cutting our ties with the Communist International. It's not that we'll refuse, to speak to dissident communist workers who come to us, but we are no longer seeing that as the primary struggle. And that opened the door to involvement in mass struggles of the American working class, mass involvement in mass mobilizations, of unemployed workers, of prisoner defense struggles like that organized around the Free Tom Mooney campaign. A whole series of doors were thus opened to the Trotskyists, and it started to bear fruit, particularly in late 1933, 1934, with various class struggles and other mobilizations that we'll probably talk about.
Yeah, I would love to turn to talking a little bit about these struggles and mass mobilizations in among the U.S. working class that you just mentioned, that the U.S. Trotskyists were then able to take part in the 1930s. So the U.S. Trotskyists played a big role in the struggles in Minneapolis in particular, and James P. Cannon himself said that these struggles were a crucial test for American Trotskyists. Could you talk a bit about these struggles and mass mobilizations and the ways in which they were important for building a revolutionary party, but also for making inroads into broader sectors of the working class?
Yeah, the background to the Minneapolis Teamster strikes of 1934 that I'll talk about in a minute were Trotskyist involvements in two other sectors that in some senses preceded Minneapolis, and from which Cannon and others learned a great deal. One was they did a great deal of work in the early 1930s in a dissident miners movement in Illinois called the Progressive Miners Movement. It was an uphill battle. They had some people on the ground there who were very influential. They always had to kind of work with them closely, and they never were able to actually assimilate them to revolutionary politics. But in those struggles, they did learn a great deal, including the very important role that women in masculinist fields like mining could play in mass struggles. So the progressive miners had a women's auxiliary that played just a dynamic role in the struggle and in picket lines and in prisoner support and in raising funds and money and in standing behind the men who were actually on strike. So that was, and that would, I think, school canon and others in the necessity of sort of bringing women into struggles, even when the work sectors were overwhelmingly, and they really were overwhelmingly male. The other strike that happened that, in some senses, put Canon and the Communist League of America on the map was a major hotel strike in 1933-34 in New York City, which was led by a mercurial element who'd gravitated to the Communist League of America named B.J. Field. He had befriended Trotsky. He was a very able economist, and he was precipitated into a leadership of this strike by the fact that he spoke many languages, and the French chefs were very enamored of him. He was their Napoleon. But well, he gravitated to the Communist League of America again, like some of their leaders, key leaders in the Progressive Miners of Illinois. He was never really assimilated to the politics of the Communist League of America and to Trotskyism. And in the end, while Cannon, Shachtman, Hugo Oler, and many other figures of long-standing in the Trotskyist movement played a decisive role in the hotel strike. They ended up that strike ended up being lost. Field ended up being expelled, but Cannon and the Communist League of America showed, in some senses, that they could be active participants in the class struggle, but that they had a perspective that allowed them, and that in fact made it imperative for them to keep a kind of disciplined rein over sort of mavericks, even among their own ranks, like Field. And in some senses, in expelling Field, they showed that, okay, we're not going to behave in an opportunistic way, as in fact so many Communist Party, strikes had been led astray by opportunistic turns. And this, I think, the fruits of all of this were borne out in the sort of just immensely important Minneapolis Teamster strikes of 1934. Minneapolis had been a center of Cannon's recruitment to the Communist League of America from the very early days. There were three brothers there who were brothers of his very good friend, who, as I said, he broke from, Bill Dunn. There was Vincent Ray Dunn, Miles Dunn, and Grant Dunn. And along with Carl Skoglund, a Scandinavian former Wobbly, they were the leadership of the Minneapolis Teamsters. And they had been working on organizing the coal yard workers since the late 20s. But they had a very protracted understanding, and they confronted an international brotherhood of Teamsters that considered itself a craft union, and therefore sort of above and beyond the masses of workers who worked in the transportation sector, who worked in markets and hauled crates of groceries and other things, and chickens. They called them chicken pluckers. The point about what the Trotskyists managed to do in the course of 1 year and 3 strikes. I mean, imagine a union today going through 3 strikes in 1 year. It's unfathomable, right? In 1 year, by 1934, and they'd been at it for, as I said, for 5-6 years and more, a small group, a nucleus of Trotskyists, managed to take a union that had a membership of less than 150 to a union with 7,000 members. They turned an open shop town, which is what Minneapolis had been in the 1920s, into a bastion of trade union defense. And the entire trade union movement was galvanized by this. The strikes were bloody. They faced not only recalcitrant employers who had, who tried to infiltrate their ranks with stool pigeons. They faced a, a resolute sort of army of police, a municipal leader, the mayor, who was as tightly sort of bound in with capital as it's possible to imagine. And even more importantly, in some ways, they faced down a governor of the state, Floyd Olson, who was a farmer labor governor and who sort of wore the hat of a friend of the working man at the same time that he would send the National Guard in to break the strike. Now, this is a formidable array of opponents to find yours, as well as, by the way, Roosevelt's, national labor mediators who were sent in to try to, unctuously dripping with, offers of good intentions to bring the workers and the bosses together. Um, this was an amazing battle in 1934. And 1934 was a year that saw workers, in some senses, climb out of the doldrums of the Great Depression and begin to fight back. It took that long. Really, there were virtually no struggles or strikes of much consequence from 29 to 32. And people were mired in unemployment. The Great Depression was a depressing phenomenon. 1934 saw three strikes that fought against this: the Minneapolis truckers, the auto parts workers in Toledo, led by a group headed up by A.J. Musty, a radical, pacifist turned radical turned revolutionary, and Harry Bridges and the Communist Party's leadership of the Longshoremen in San Francisco. All of these strikes took place, by the way, outside of the ranks of the red, quote, sectarian unions that the Communist Party had been trying to set up. They were all strikes that took place in workplaces where the conservative American Federation of Labor had actually, sunk its tentacles. Of those strikes, the Minneapolis Teamster strikes were the most successful, the most resolute, and in some senses paved the way for the great upheavals of the Congress of Industrial Organization, mass production, industrial unionism in 1937, of which the Flint sit-down strike was, one sort of major momentous event. And even John L. Lewis, who was in some senses the main sort of bureaucratic architect of some of those CIO struggles, he looked at Minneapolis in 1934, and he saw the blood in the streets, and he saw the writing in the wall because of what the Trotskyists had done there. So it was a momentous struggle, and the strikes were run with military discipline. They had huge headquarters set up. They had nurses and doctors set up to look after people that they knew would be physically, damaged in the struggle. They put out their own newspaper, a daily newspaper, The Organizer, which countered the boss's claims in the mainstream press. They formed a vibrant women's auxiliary, which, did domestic labor like feeding and the workers who came into the strike hall, but also, was active in keeping women involved in the struggle. Picket line duty. There's one of the great photographs in my book is of two women squaring off in a picket line battle with clubs. A bourgeois woman and a proletarian woman, and they are fighting in the street. Now that was rare; there were far more men who fought, but that happened, and it broke, in some senses, down the sort of gendered sort of barriers of women's involvement in the class struggle. So there's, if you can't pick up the hefty, volume of canon that has this account, there is a separate book that Haymarket published a few years ago called Revolutionary Teamsters, which is about the trucker strikes of 1934.
Yeah, it's such an incredible and powerful story. Like the amount of effort and the amount of planning, like you mentioned about the press that they were publishing at the time, the militancy, the resoluteness. It's yeah, really really powerful stuff. And I mean, speaking of, you mentioned earlier AJ Musty, I wanted to move forward a bit to kind of the end of this period that we're discussing, like around 1938, and I want to get to the SWP, the Socialist Workers Party. Could you describe some of the key events that led up to the founding of the Socialist Workers Party, especially things like the entry into the Socialist Party? And could you comment also on like what kind of party Cannon hoped to build with the SWP?
Yeah, I mean, when Cannon wrote about the Minneapolis strikes of 1934 and their successes, he always made the point that the reason these struggles had come to the success that they did was because there was behind them a disciplined uh, kernel of a party in the Communist League of America. And he wasn't saying that the party controlled everything, because so many events happen in a struggle that are not controlled, that are outside the dimensions of control of any individual group of people or organization. But he did see that it was that the existence of that kernel of a party allowed for the leadership to take positions and have a perspective on the struggle that was both realistic and that would move the struggle forward. He never said, and this is so different from what the Communist Party, apparatchiks and the trade unions often said. He never said this was a revolutionary event, the strike of 1934. He said it's a struggle for trade union recognition. It's a struggle for better conditions. We lead it on that basis. We strive to achieve ends on that basis. And in doing that, we convince workers that we have a foresight and a larger perspective, and that we are good leaders, that we have their interests at heart. And out of that will come recruits to a movement. And we will build a party on that basis, not by proclaiming every strike a great victory, and not by saying we have to fight in the streets to defeat, all of our enemies at this moment, which he maintained in 1934. It's not a revolutionary moment. It is not. Unlike the Communist Party, who claimed that it was, and that attacked the leadership of the Minneapolis General Strike, for instance, for not bringing the government down, attacking the governor. What Cannon always said is, no, what we do with the governor is that we take his two-faced kind of approach to being a friend of the worker on Monday, but sending in the National Guard on Wednesday. We take that and we exploit that. We take the space that offers us to wring from him what we can get. We understand he's not our friend. We teach the workers he's not our friend. But we don't, take up arms, and assail the state capitol, which is actually, in some senses, I'm being a bit hyperbolic here, what the CP was actually arguing that they should do. I mean, it was incredible. So he always said, Cannon, this revolutionary leadership is central. So after you go through a strike like that, then, what's the next step? Well, there could be many more strikes. And the Trotskyists would have, had they had the numbers, involved themselves in those strikes. But what it was also important to do was to try to regroup the fragmented elements of the potentially revolutionary left into a larger, party that could actually have the capacity to rival the communists. Remember, the communists were hundreds of times bigger than the Trotskyists as an organization on the left. I mentioned, and you mentioned Musty and the Toledo strike. Well, the workers, the Musty had formed the American Workers' Party. And what Toledo and Minneapolis did was, in some senses, show that the American Workers' Party and the Communist League of America were on a similar trajectory. They both had a critique of the Stalinists and the Communist Party. They both believed in essentially a politics of class struggle. So the first step towards the creation of the SWP and this larger party was a fusion of the American Workers' Party and the Communist League of America. And so they formed a group called the Workers' Party. And Cannon and Musty were actually very close for a time, spoke together on many podiums, and many, many very good recruits to Trotskyism were won by this fusion, people who stayed firm canonists for the rest of their lives. As this is happening, Trotsky was trying to negotiate how to, actually bring the left together in Europe, how to, actually put into practice the politics of anti-fascism that was, the United Front politics of anti-fascism that were needed, and to build an to build the international left opposition into a more powerful force. And he devised a project in this same period called the French Turn, in which the Trotskyist groups, which were small, would enter, for instance, the French Socialist Party, where there were masses of workers who were rising up angry and who were apart from and distinct from the Communist Party, which was, of course, very large and hegemonic on the French left. The Trotskyists in America, after the fusion with the Mustyites, said, "Okay, well, we can make a similar turn, enter into the Socialist Party in the United States." And the Socialist Party at that time, led by Norman Thomas in the early 1930s, was getting a sizable, vote in electoral presidential contests. And because things were starting to move in the Great Depression, youth were being radicalized, workers were being, saw in the 1934 struggles and other class conflicts that it was possible to actually struggle against the confinements of the Great Depression and capitalist employment. So there was all kinds of things happening that suggested that that a move into the Socialist Party might garner victories and recruits for Trotskyism. So in 1936, 37, the Workers' Party formally dissolved, and its members entered into the Socialist Party. Now, they kept an actual organizational apparatus clandestinely alive. They had a committee that met regularly in New York. But the dangers of this turn into the Socialist Party was, how would it be actually, undertaken? And Cannon ended up being, and this is, I think, one of the most original and most developed and most significant parts of the book. Cannon ended up almost standing ground alone. He had an instinctual kind of affinity with what Trotsky's view on entry was. But he had to fight people like Max Shachtman and even old allies like Arnie Swaback. By this time, Musty had gone. He'd reconverted to religion. He'd had a epiphany in a church in Paris, and he'd gone back to the church. But his followers, for the most part, remained. Cannon's approach to the entry was very unlike that of his comrades who stayed in New York City. Their orientation was basically to try to hitch their wagon to the cart of a group that seemed to be leaning left in the leadership, but separate from Norman Thomas, a group called the Militants. Many of them would later be called the Clarity Group and the Clarityites. Cannon originally probably thought that this might not be a bad way to go, but he was always prone, when faced with a kind of a crisis, to want to go on the road and kind of resume his agitational role that he had, so sort of cherished when he was an IWW hobo activist. And what he did was he went on the road, and he went to California, where he set up basically a newspaper, Labor Action, and where he almost came close to taking over the Socialist Party. He hooked up with a Socialist Party militant, a guy named Trimble, and together they, along with work in the Sailors Union of the Pacific and other maritime unions, they developed connections to the working class. They developed, a very strong presence in the Socialist Party of California. And all the while, Cannon knew eventually the shoe's going to drop. The leadership of the party, Socialist Party, is not going to tolerate us doing this. The sort of sectarian dismissal of Trotskyists is that they're splitters and wreckers. Cannon's activity in the Socialist Party was anything but. He was a builder. Now, he was building by intervening in class struggles, by drawing to him radicalized revolutionary youth and workers from the Socialist Party, and by showing them this is the way forward. But he also spoke at electoral rallies for Norman Thomas. He built the Socialist Party. He created a newspaper. In the end, yes, Norman Thomas and the leadership and the militants and the Clarityites, they all moved against him. And he ended up, ultimately, Shachtman and those around him came to see that both Trotsky and Cannon were right. We are going to get expelled, and they were. But when they were expelled, they took with them a significant sector of the Socialist Party's radicalizing youth and militant workers. And that was the background to the formation, I believe, on New Year's Day, 1938, of the Socialist Workers' Party, a party that Cannon saw and Trotsky recognized as the leading, largest, and most significant class struggle-steeled Trotskyist organization in what would be formed later that summer as the Fourth International. It was really the American Trotskyist movement that carried international Trotskyism into the 1940s. And the party that Cannon saw as central to his, political project, the Socialist Workers' Party, was the kind of party that he always envisioned could be created out of the sort of degeneration of the Communist International. It was a party of class struggle, a party that interacted with the working class on a realist, not an otherworldly basis, a party that, while there was democratic centralism and while there had to be discipline, it also had room for discussion and dissidence. And sometimes that dissidence would end up breaking from the SWP, as it did in a series of faction fights in which people like Goldwyn, Morrow, CLR James, Cochrane, and others in the 40s and 50s would establish. But the party that Cannon wanted to build was a revolutionary organization on the Bolshevik model that was disciplined, centralist, but democratic, that was class struggle oriented, and that could build uh, coalitions and movements and alliances with wider social movements like the civil rights struggle, uh, and that would actually unite a fragmented American working class in the realization of the kind of socialist dream that he always saw as both necessary and possible.
We're kind of wrapping up this conversation at a bit of a funny point because now we're actually at the start of the SWP's long history and the first years of the Fourth International. So in this sense, there are many decades left of American Trotskyism to cover in the future, and there's of course much more to cover in terms of James P. Cannon's life. But as a way of concluding today, I kind of wanted to circle back to Trotsky and Trotsky's view of this movement, the American Trotskyist movement. So Trotsky was really enthusiastic about this American section of the Fourth International, and Cannon wrote actually in 1953, quote, that Trotsky leaned so heavily on the Americans and was so anxious to strengthen their authority in the International that when he drew up the transitional program, he wrote it first for the SWP. So, one of my last questions to you today really is why did Trotsky see so much potential in this relatively small group of US communists?
Well, I think Trotsky saw the importance of the American contingent because that that body of revolutionaries had actually intersected with the class struggles of the United States, particularly in Minneapolis in 1934, in such dramatic and successful ways. The transitional program, which Trotsky drafted, and which he ran by the leadership of the American Trotskyist movement, had in fact been crafted in part out of conversations that he had with Cannon, Shachtman, Rose Carstner, who was Cannon's partner, and others in Mexico, in the late 30s. Cannon had also seen, or Trotsky had also seen that not only were his American followers the most adroit at intersecting the class struggles in their national settings, they had also been the most supportive of his own plight in the later 30s and before his assassination in 1940. In his struggles against Stalinist calumny and defamation. So that it had been the American Trotskyist movement that had actually put together the Dewey Commission that explored the allegations that had come out of the Communist International in the wake of the Moscow trials, that Trotsky had colluded with fascists, that he was a capitalist agent, et cetera, et cetera. All of them lies. It was figures. It was the Trotskyist movement in the United States that had bankrolled much of the production of the international Trotskyist movement and the Fourth International in terms of their publications, Trotsky's writings, and it was Cannon's followers who went down to be bodyguards, in Mexico when Trotsky faced repeated assassination attempts, ultimately and tragically successful. So you really didn't have any other Trotskyist movement that had this record, of achievement. And in fact, when Cannon who spoke no foreign languages, when he went to Europe for the founding convention of the Fourth International, which was a small and clandestine affair taking place, when war was happening and or on the eve of war, and as Trotskyists feared assassination, not only from Stalinists but also from fascists. Trotsky wrote to praise Cannon's role in bringing together the forces of the Fourth International to Rose Karsner. He said, we could use a lot more Jims over here. Um, so, and he had far more, and I show this in detail in the book, he had far more trust, for instance, in Cannon's kind of resolute proletarian revolutionism than he did in Shachtman's, who, while Shachtman had a felicity with European languages and got along exceedingly well with elements of the European Trotskyist milieu, and was in fact far more comfortable than Cannon in those circles. Trotsky, understood that Shachtman was a more of a mercurial kind of chummy political figure who might miss or actually obfuscate opportunistic tendencies and adrift in wrong directions. Trotsky had and Cannon, it should be said, very early in their the relationship of the Communist League of America with Trotsky, Cannon wasn't necessarily willing to jump on the bandwagon and just implicitly trust Trotsky. He tested him a couple of times in the early 30s to see. He wanted to know, is this guy going to function the same way, that the apparatchiks and the Stalinist emissaries functioned in the Communist Party in the 20s? Because I'm not going to, put up with that if that's the case. But they had a comradely, of course, but also I think just a deeply respectful and intuitively aligned with one another. Cannon, of course, was not Trotsky in terms of his theoretical acumen and his just capacities on an abstract level. But he was precisely the kind of concrete proletarian, activist that Trotsky knew any revolution was going to be dependent upon.
This has been a really great conversation. Thank you so much for being here, for taking the time to talk to us today.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. It was great. I appreciated your questions, and it's been fun. Hopefully we'll do it on the third volume.
Definitely. Would love that. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts and share the show with your friends, your family, coworkers, classmates, comrades, and anyone else who you want to radicalize. And finally, Left Voice is an independent, revolutionary socialist publication, which means that we completely rely on the support of our members and our sympathizers. So that we can continue to bring you more episodes of All That's Left, please subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/leftvoice. We're really excited about this project, and we hope that you'll join us on this journey.